Next, we'll talk about the hookworms, which are another type of nematode. There are two different species of hookworm. Obviously, in the US, we would see the New World hookworm, and this is what their faces, quote unquote, look like under a microscope. In the external environment, again, you'll have an egg. The eggs, in this case, actually hatch into larvae in the soil, and the larvae can directly burrow in and penetrate the host's skin. Eventually, what these worms will do is make their way to the lungs, the trachea, the pharynx, so that they can be swallowed and go down into the intestines. Again, because they are nematodes, there are male and female, so two different sexes. They will reproduce, lay their eggs. The eggs will be passed in feces. The egg will mature, turn into the larvae, and again and again and again with the life cycle. In humans, they don't always get to the right place. Hookworms are more common in the right place in dogs. But again, in humans, they will sometimes migrate through the tissue. So this is a person who stepped obviously on some larvae and they burrowed in through the skin of the foot. This is also a person, you can kind of see the time course of where the worm burrowed. It left bruising and a reaction. So the worms in people can cause an allergic reaction and a rash. They sometimes can migrate to the lungs or GI tract, but it's not as common. Again, humans are not really their host, so we don't often see that type of successful infection. And patients can develop anemia if the worms are successful and are feeding in the body. For hookworm, the eggs are found in the feces. Again, there are some treatments available that target the adults. Blood transfusions for severe anemia, proper hygiene, sanitation, wearing of shoes all serve as preventatives. You also want to make sure that your pets are treated for worms. And then I found this headline a few years ago where again you can see that a patient was infected with hookworm after a trip to the beach. So you can see where the worms burrowed into his skin. Our final nematode is not one that we actually do see in the US, but it's disturbing and interesting, so I thought I would share it with you. This is Loa loa. It's transmitted by mosquitoes. The larval form is what is transmitted by the mosquitoes. They will get into the lymphatic system where they'll mature into an adult. The adults will reproduce. This one has a very complex life stage. So again, I'm not going to ask you about all the different stages of larvae and microfilariae and all of that. So they get into circulation, they get into the blood, and then they can be picked up, like basically kind of one of the larval stages will be picked up again by another mosquito. The reason I include it is because sometimes patients will actually have the microfilariae, which is just a stage of the life cycle, in the eye. So these are found in Africa. Monkeys are the reservoir hosts, and they're transmitted by mosquitoes or mango flies. In patients who experience symptoms, they can appear approximately 1 year after the bite. The worms are actually really slow growing, so it takes them time to mature and start reproducing. Patients may experience a transient swelling as the worms migrate. So as the larvae migrate through the body after the mosquito bite, or as the microfilariae are moving through the body. So it will be painful with eosinophilia. So eosinophils will kind of rush to the area. It can be diagnosed through observation of worms and microfilariae in the blood. There are some treatments. Ivermectin is it's a parasite treatment, not a COVID treatment, just FYI. It's a parasite treatment, and they can help reduce microfilarial loads. The reason I included this, one, it's really gross that it goes to the eye, and that's kind of a really disturbing image, but the treatment is actually really interesting as well. The worms have to be surgically removed from the eye because they are going to be causing tissue damage as they migrate through. So they're removed surgically. by immobilizing the worm with 10% cocaine solution dropped onto the eye. So I thought that was really interesting. And then here you can see one of the worms surrounded by cells. Okay. So that was the last of our nematodes. Now we'll move into our trematodes or trematodes. These are our flatworms. So they're flat, fleshy worms. They have an incomplete digestive system, and they are hermaphroditic. So they are capable of self-fertilization and self-reproduction. They almost always require an intermediate host, so they have to be inside of some other organism. They may have multiple intermediate hosts, but regardless, for all known trematodes, the first intermediate host, so if they have multiple, there could be others. If they have only one, that's it. But the first intermediate host is going to be some kind of mollusk. Our first trematode is Fasciola hepatica, or the sheep liver fluke. So let's start with the egg being deposited or released in the feces. Human, sheep, cattle. So even though it's called the sheep liver fluke, it's not always sheep. So there will be an egg passed in the feces. The egg will mature into a particular life stage that will burrow into a snail. So there's the mollusk. Once it matures, it will be released from the snail, and then it will be found on water plants. The water plants will be ingested, especially if they're not cooked, and there will be a life stage again inside of the main host, human, sheep, or cattle. That's where the adults will be, in the human, sheep, or cattle. They tend to go to the bile duct, which is why it's a liver fluke. It goes to like the liver area. And what we see in patients who have this infection is that migration of the worm through the liver can cause swelling of the liver, which can lead to enlargement and tenderness or pain. In the bile ducts, this can also lead to inflammation of the liver, so hepatitis, that's what that means, just inflammation of the liver, and obstruction of some of the bile ducts. In areas where perhaps there was a loss of blood supply or too much tissue damage, you have these necrotic foci that's sometimes called liver rot. Now, this doesn't sound like something that we might have in the US, but it certainly is. It is found worldwide in especially sheep raising areas that have the appropriate snail intermediate hosts. And that would include places like Russia, Japan, Egypt, Latin America, and the US. Typically, when we see patients infected with sheep liver fluke, it was through the consumption of contaminated watercress. If you cook it, it should be fine, but that's what we see. It can be diagnosed through the presence of eggs in the bile. There are some treatments available, but of course, prevention would involve avoiding watercress and other uncooked water vegetation. The second flatworm trematode that we're going to talk about causes a disease called Paragonimiasis. The one that we have in the United States is Paragonimus kellicoti. Sometimes this is called the lung fluke. So again, we'll follow the life stage. And again, I'm not going to ask you to remember all of the details. This one has a little bit more of a complex life cycle than the Fasciola hepatica, than the sheep liver fluke. It has 2 intermediate hosts. So we'll start here with the deposition of an egg in the water. So there's an embryonated egg in the water. The egg will mature. That life stage will penetrate into a snail. So there's the first intermediate host, that's a mollusk. And then this, there will be some maturation and development inside of the snail. One of the life stages will then leave the snail and get into a crustacean. So here's its second intermediate host. The form in the crustacean is generally then going to be consumed, let's say by a human, and then the parasite will continue to mature The adult will penetrate the intestinal wall, migrate through the abdominal cavity, penetrate the diaphragm, and get into the lung. The adult form of the parasite is then found in the lung and possibly other sites in the body, maybe still in the intestines, there could be some. And the adults will then begin reproducing it and producing eggs. So from ingestion to the production of eggs is about 2 to 3 months. And because this does like to go to the lungs, the diagnostic stage could be the presence of the eggs in either the feces or the sputum. Okay. So the adult worms will produce the eggs found in the sputum or swallowed and passed in feces. In the US, again, I told you it's the Paragonimiasis kellicoti, and that's associated with crabs and crayfish in eastern and midwestern areas of the US. As the larvae move through the body, move out of the intestines and try to get to the lungs, that can induce fever and chills. The adults in the lungs can cause fever, cough, and increased sputum production. And the body can form these kind of cavities around the worms that can lead to bleeding and chest pain, secondary infections, fibrosis. And one of the things to remember when you're thinking about these parasites that potentially could be burrowing through the body is it's not like they have a map telling them where to go. So sometimes they go places that maybe they didn't intend to go, like the brain, and that can cause severe neurologic disease. Paragonimiasis will be diagnosed through eggs in the sputum or feces. X-rays can show damage from the lungs. A patient can be given some serological tests because remember, these are going to burrow and go through the body, so there will be an immune response. There is a treatment available to get rid of the adult flukes. And prevention, well, do not eat undercooked crabs or crayfish. Cook your crabs, cook your crayfish, and you should be fine.